Great. So I know I'm standing between you and your lunch, and thank you for the title, Valerie. But scholarship perhaps isn't something to keep you away from your sandwich. So I'm going to explode it and unwrap it a little more in this talk. And unusually for me, I'm not really speaking from a pre-prepared lecture. I'm going to try and speak from the heart, because I think that's where we all have to start today in today's world. As Valerie said at the beginning of the conference, 13 years ago, FIT hosted the Symposium Fashion Quality, the rise of the fashion exhibition. And I wrote up my lecture notes for this edition of Fashion Theory after that great conference, quite contentious conference, as all the best conferences are contentious. At that time, I was head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum. 3 years later, in 2011, I moved back into the academy to Edinburgh College of Art and the University of Edinburgh. And a year and a half ago, I moved again back into the museum and gallery world, where I'm now Director of Collection and Research in an art gallery in the National Galleries of Scotland. But fashion is still my first interest. And just to reflect a bit on what I said then, because so much has changed. Oh my word, we live in a different world. The paper itself was quite nostalgic even then. I was looking back 10 years ago to another contentious conference that happened at Platt Hall that was celebrating their 50th anniversary then in Manchester in the United Kingdom. And there was an infamous schism there, perhaps between fashion museology and dress museology, that you explained the difference there. In some ways, that was being played out at that conference many years ago between an established generation of dress curators and an emerging generation of new fashion theorists, a younger generation of fashion curators at the moment when fashion theory was in its early days. And I was giving, perhaps in my paper in this journal, thanks for a new spirit of collaboration between the museum and the academy, the way things had moved on. It was a collaboration that around the millennium and in the first decade of the 21st century, at least in the UK, that was a positive, quite utopian one. There'd been massive capital investment in museums and galleries in the UK, across Europe, in the United States as well at that moment. We had a new Labour government then. The creative industries were incredibly important as a framework within which curatorial practices happened. They helped museums an understanding of what the creative industries and the museum sector might do if they came together. And there was a massive expansion of university programs and funded research around fashion, around curation, around fashion in the arts and humanities in that first decade of the 21st century. But I noted a few recent trends in the paper. I talked about some exhibitions I'd worked on as well. And I talked particularly about this idea of collaborative work and collaborative scholarship, a community of scholars and curators working together, bringing together historical and contemporary knowledge. And I ended the lecture in the paper with a quotation on the future. And I used a quotation from Callum Story, an architect and exhibition designer who had just written a book called The Delirious Museum. And I said, what fun times that we are living in a museum context that might be delirious, slightly mad, but hugely creative and wanting to move forward. Now, not to depress you, how things have changed. In 2019, if that was the moment of promised utopia, now we live in the moment of perpetual crisis. In the world at large, since then, we've seen a major financial crash. We've seen the rise of this term, more recently, populism, across the political and public sphere. I daren't mention the names, but in my own world, we've seen Brexit, Here, perhaps, we've seen Trump. In the UK, the research environment has shifted from a focus on individual scholarship to ideas around impact, the strategic value of research and the way that it can generate money in an impoverished sector at the moment. We've seen the imposition of thematic research themes. As a curator or an academic, if you want to apply for funds now, they have to fit preconceived ideas set by the research councils in the UK that are often strategic and have social ends, which is good, but it constrains the imagination in some ways. I think universities have become fully monetized in the UK. You're perhaps more used to that here in the US. And they've become much more focused on what is seen now as the consumer in the university, the student. So there's been a shift from research back to teaching. In some ways a good thing, in other ways a problematic thing. Scholarship in the university itself is a contested word, and one could say that the university in the world is in crisis at the moment in terms of its identity. National museums, where I now work now and where I used to work when I was at the V&A, national museums in the UK used to receive 70% of their funding from the government, from the taxpayer in 2006. Now in 2019, most of them are lucky to get around 20% of their funding from the taxpayer and the government. So they have to make up that differential, which may explain why there's a shift towards the world of fashion as a money earner in the National Museum. And we live in an era where expertise, at least in the UK, is derided or mistrusted in this frame of populism. So scholars are often on the defensive. They are seen as part of the much maligned world of the elites. So we have to do something about this. We can't just pull the quilt over our heads and go back to sleep in the morning and hope it all goes away. We have to adapt and we have to change. And I want to talk a little bit about how we're changing, and it reflects on some of the recent papers we've heard this morning, the great papers we've heard this morning. So, this is where I may end up getting the sack, given that this is live streamed across the world. So I hope my colleagues are not listening. And the medium is not the message here. Manifestos are usually written by dictators or by politicians. But this was something I did to get my current job. We were asked in interview to say what the curator needed to be in the 21st century. So I wrote this short manifesto, which I will go through with you in the next 15 minutes or so. I don't work in an institution that's got a fashion collection per se. The National Galleries of Scotland, as I say, is an art museum, but it does include much of relevance to the fashion collector, from portraits at the Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh to a great historical collection, from Poussin's Sacraments to Sargent portraits to a great collection of surrealist works. So there's all sorts of things I can do about fashion as I continue to work there. But in the last year, since I got the job on the basis of this manifesto, I've really been working with colleagues in the curatorial section, which I'm responsible for as Director of Collection and Research, on redesigning their job descriptions. How they've loved that over the past year. We used to have 22 bespoke job descriptions, many of which have been in place for at least the past 30 years, which were constraining curators within a particular mode of practice. I've managed to get it down to 6. And I've got the curators to write their own job descriptions in relation to what is needed in the 21st century, not what was needed in 1972, which some of them were referring back to. And I was looking towards creating, though you might not think of it by what I've just said, a cohesive, connected, collegial museum, a new model of museum that reflects some of the things we've heard in the previous paper. So 10 points in this manifesto. Quickly. Sorry, Valerie, I'm not trying to curry favour. Here is the first. Can you read the text? Because I don't like reading out PowerPoint text because you can read it on the screen. So I hope you can read these. I will just summarize them. The first point is about leadership. I think Alexandra in her paper earlier on talked about this dastardly curate word. Everybody curates now. I blame it on Hans Ulrich Obrist and a generation of contemporary art curators and contemporary art practitioners in the 1990s who switched us all within the cultural sector towards the curatorial turn, where everybody curates. So in a sense, we have to take hold and we have to demonstrate leadership, and we have to own the concept of curation back in the museum and gallery sector and within our broader sector. We need to own the term, and we need to demonstrate that we're moving forward with it. We don't need to be defensive and hold back, try to contain a notion of what the curator means. We need to dictate in some ways what it is. Don't want to put Valerie's image up there with a dictator, but a great image of leadership, of the first premise in my manifesto. This is perhaps the opposite notion of what the museum leader might be, although, like Valerie, this is one of my heroes. For those who don't know who this is Sir Roy Strom. Sir Roy, as he's known affectionately in the UK, director of the Victoria and Albert Museum in the late 1970s and early 1980s, very instrumental in founding the Costume Society in the UK. I think he was the first chair in 1965 when he was director of the National Portrait Gallery in London. The theme here is about democracy. When I was growing up, when I was a 7-year-old boy going to the local library in provincial West Country, England, Sir Roy Strom had written 2 massive volumes on Elizabethan portraiture, which were his PhD in the 1960s at the Warburg Institute. And I love those volumes. I tried to keep them at home. I would never take them back to the library just to be renewed until they told me to stop having these volumes. He represented everything I wanted to be in terms of a curator and writer. But he also represents an old world. The theme here is really about democracy, because his public pronouncements, the way he ran the V&A, probably appropriate in the late 70s and 80s, was about being a custodian of knowledge, was about owning knowledge, representing expertise in what we would now call a bad elitist way, I suppose. We need to cut through that, I think, to move away from defensive elitism, from broadcast, towards engagement and connection, from curate to co-curate. Something I think that a generation of Sir Roys would find troubling and uncomfortable. So that's about a generational shift. I think the third point in the manifesto is about what we might call mediatization. Curation, as I think in the dress museology definition that we heard before, is often about care, conserving, again containing. But we live now in a world, of course, where knowledge is out there, and other forms of media, aside from the Fashion Museum, are demonstrating far more innovative methods, both of communicating what fashion might be and of communicating with massive new audiences. This is Nick Knight, for those who know the image here, founder of Show Studio, in some ways a sort of online contemporary fashion museum in 2000, taken much further forward by Penny Martin, now working in journalism. one of the first, I think, virtual online galleries to understand the power of new forms of knowledge, new formations of creativity, through showing the entire creative process in the fashion sphere. And this is the competition that fashion exhibitions within the museum, within the real space, face now, which they didn't 20 years ago. So the curator has to understand that they are living in this world and dealing with these sorts of audiences and possible platforms. The next point is really about situation and space. If that was about a post-space form of exhibiting, this point in the manifesto is about where curation actually takes place in the real world. And this conference is focusing on exhibitions and exhibitionism, but of course the curator's sphere of practice is much wider than that in the spaces of the museum. It was great to go backstage just now to go to the toilet, because you just fell upon all these dark spaces where all sorts of interesting things happen. And since moving back into the gallery space, sorry, not those sorts of things, moving back into the gallery space, I've realized that the exhibition space, the public space of the exhibition that most of our audiences see, is only a fraction of where the action takes place. And I love this idea of front and back space and how they work together, that it's not a binary, that you have to have both working in tandem, and that scholarly practice as well flows through those different sorts of spaces, different sorts of disciplines, sometimes colliding and sometimes disrupting, forming what some fashion curators, some in the audience and speakers today have called a new scenography of fashion curation. This is the sort of show that excites me, slightly off-piste for this point in the manifesto, but it's Antwerp. It's a collaboration between MoMU and the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp, commemorating the 100th anniversary of Wouter's, particular post-impressionist painter, of his death, bringing together fashion and art in an interesting collision in the space. Then number 5, we have access. A curator in the 21st century needs to really understand what access means. Consider here, this is the V&A's new building in London, proposed new building in London in Stratford, bringing together academic institutions, London College of Fashion, Chelsea School of Art, I think, and media, with its collection that's moved from Blythe House in the west of London, an old Edwardian post office building that was closed to the public, except you had to make special application to go and see the collection. Here in its new space, open to everybody, theoretically. We're doing the same thing in Scotland. I was astounded when I came into my post to realize that only 3% of our collection is on the gallery walls at any one time. That 97% of our collection is in stores in the suburbs of Edinburgh. Now, scholars and researchers, indeed anyone actually, can make an appointment to come and look at items in store, but often the waiting list is such, because of resource, that it's a month at least, and it's a highly controlled experience. Great for people to get behind the scenes, but not really opening up access in a way that audiences and visitors might expect in the 21st century. So we're moving our whole collection down to an ex-industrial area on the edge of Edinburgh that's being rebuilt with cultural institutions like Stratford at the moment, which is a hybrid between the museum and the store, an open store, almost an exhibition that anybody can come into, where new technologies allow anyone to come in without a curator having to be there to care. It might be more of a challenge with fashion objects than it is for paintings and drawings and prints that I work with now, but I think it is the future. this opening up, this new sense of access, not owning culture, but allowing access towards it. We've heard a little about the post-disciplinary nature of curatorship, or the need to be able to move deftly between disciplines. And as I said with the MoMA example, I really enjoy exhibitions that willfully break disciplinary boundaries and that move scholarship on to another place. I enjoyed this one, Sophia Hedman and Serge. Judith, shout out the surname Serge's. Anyway, at the Liljevalchs Museum and Gallery in Sweden in 2015. It was slightly delirious for any of you who went there. Huge posing questions, moving from one visual experience to another, but audiences seem to be really engaging and loving that sense of the unexpected, that sense of being moved to a place where you might actually feel slightly uncomfortable and slightly challenged. I've always thought that the edge is a better place to inhabit than the center. And this sort of post-disciplinary idea for curators is something that's important. Number 7, of course, the collection and the object, and a focus on the object, is still at the core of all of this. It's not about throwing that out. We're rewriting our own collection development policy right now at my museum, questioning what its function is. It seems to be more about curators needing to show due diligence and to stick within a legal framework than understanding what new audiences might want from the collection as we add to it. So why aren't we asking those questions, or why haven't we in the past? Why is an acquisition policy something owned by the museum and not shared with its visitors and audiences? So some calculated risk there. We see some great projects in the UK where the museum is being really vigorously challenged by other groups. The volunteer, Dan Nouveau at the V&A, in his queer LGBTQ tours of the museum's collection and blog about the collection, is wonderful. It's not coming from the center of the museum, it's coming from its edges and from its constituencies. Sarah Wahid's big project, Museum Detox, which challenges the imperial histories of museum collecting. Again, we don't need to be defensive about that and sending those queries to the press department every time and worrying about them. They are about the debates that museums need to have if they stay alive. So we need to communicate. We need to be advocates. Neil McGregor, ex-director of the British Museum, St. Neil, as many of my colleagues refer to him, is perhaps a great example of taking the British Museum's collections out there into the world and really changing people's understanding of the world's history in a hugely ambitious way in this book, radio program, and exhibition that he projected as a new form of connected, communicated, advocated curatorship. That's about smashing down those ivory towers. That's about, and I need to smash down the ivory towers that I helped to build 20 years ago, I think, in my former paper, which is why I'm slightly like the rabid convert here, talking to you all. Nearly there. Sustainability. This is the sustainable curator. Funding is a problem, but we need to know the difference between cost and value and play those two things off together. This is a slide of the Muda Museum in Lisbon, which I think, I'm thankful to my PhD student, Alessandro Bucci here, who's written very interestingly on this as a case study, in a derelict bank that essentially is part of the detritus of the financial crisis that got us into this place, inhabited, now being rebuilt, so it may lose some of this rawness, inhabited by a couture collection. It's an extraordinary juxtaposition of the way we might think about the value of our collections in not just in monetary terms, but in political terms as well. And finally, This is about interpretation and engagement. It's all about interpretation in the end. And I think I'm going to have big arguments within my own institution about where interpretation lies. Is it with the curatorial division? Are they still the owners of the knowledge? Is it with our education department, who work a lot with visitors and audiences? Is it about our marketing department, who really know the latest theories around engagement and new audiences? When I was at the V&A, we didn't use consultants, culture consultants at all. Now, I think most national museums spend a lot of time with big culture consultancy companies, what used to be called brand or trend companies, who give us a new understanding of how culture is made up and how it relates to the museum in this new, challenging world. And I think that's... we don't need to reject that. We might critique it and contest it, but we need to understand it. We need to get within it and behind it in order to be effective at making the curatorial case. Because in the end, if museums and galleries are about anything, they're about people. And that might be a controversial thing to say. A collection or an object means nothing if it's not engaging with people. So my favourite quote still remains the E.M. Forster quote at the Only Connect at the beginning of Howard's End. He was writing at a time of great crisis, but thought of a way that different groups can connect. And I think that's where the challenge of the 21st curator lies and why they need to read this manifesto. So thank you very much.